Mountain Time. I would like to welcome you all to the Interdisciplinary Conservation Seminar Series hosted by the Human Environment Systems Group at Boise State. My name's Matt Williamson. I'm an assistant professor here. And I'll be your host for the rest of the semester. Before we get started, just a few logistics to keep in mind. This session is recorded. You will be sent a link to the recording at the email that you registered with. Also, the link is available at the same website where you registered today. For the first part of the presentation, you'll all be muted, and we're asking that you keep your cameras off as a way to sort of make sure that there aren't too many lags between the presentation slides and the sound. We'll turn those back on when we get to the question and answer session towards the end. Speaking of the question and answer session, if you have questions, you're welcome to post them in the chat at any time, and I will try to moderate those when we get to the end of the session. Otherwise, you can use the, I guess it is the wave button in the participant list. And finally, I just would draw your attention to the rest of the schedule for the semester. You can go to this link and see who we've got lined up for the rest of October, November, and December. Finally, just want to say that with continuing fires on the West Coast, continuing racial violence both in the US and Canada, and the stress of a pending election both in the US and now apparently in British Columbia, everyone's probably showing up in a little bit different place. Just ask that you be kind to each other and yourselves. We're incredibly grateful that you have chosen to spend this hour with us. And speaking of incredibly grateful, it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Andrea Olive from the University of Toronto. Andrea was born in Saskatchewan, Canada, and has a PhD in political science from Purdue. She's now an associate professor in the departments of geography and political science at the University of Toronto. Her area of research is in Canada and US environmental policy, especially with respect to species conservation and species at risk. She's authored a number of papers and books, including Land Stewardship and Legitimacy, Endangered Species Policy in Canada and the United States, and The Canadian Environment in Political Context, two books I reference fairly regularly. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Andrea.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. So I first just want to begin by saying that it is Orange Shirt Day in Canada, and I am wearing the orangest shirt that I have, and this is to acknowledge the residential school system and also to recognize my role in reconciliation. And so for those of you who may not know, in the 20th century, the Canadian state took Indigenous children from their homes and placed them into schools for the purpose of civilizing them in the education system. And in doing so, they severed these children's relationships to their families, to land, to culture, to language, where still they subjected these children to physical and sexual abuse in the school system, and an unknown number of children, unnamed children for the most part, died in the school system as a result of neglect, starvation, or abuse. The last of these schools closed in 1996, so actually quite recently. And in the 1990s, Canada began the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that is an ongoing process. And so I did want to draw your attention to that. The United States does have a history of racism and white supremacy, but Canada does as well. And I also want to draw our attention to it because I really do think that people, when, especially leaders or people in power, when given platforms, should take every opportunity that they can to renounce white supremacy in all its forms. And that is what Orange Shirt Day is about. And that is why I'm wearing an orange shirt. And this also provides me with an opportunity to segue to talking about a land acknowledgement. And I think this is something really important. So it's an Indigenous protocol, but it's something important for settlers such as myself to do, and I think for conservation scholars in particular. And so it's really just a moment for us to reflect on our relationship to land, to our history, to how we came to reside on the land that we're currently on, to think about as I do, certainly in my privileged role in residing where I am. And then again, to acknowledge that colonialism is not historical, right? It is an ongoing process. And I think it's something that is alive and well in some conservation circles. So I do think that we need to continually return to this and to reflect upon it. At the University of Toronto, our official land acknowledgement is to recognize that it's the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. It is the meeting place of many Indigenous people from all across Turtle Island, and I am grateful for the opportunity to work and reside on that land. However, I am speaking to you today from my home in Saskatchewan, which is on Treaty 4 land. And so that's the land of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, as well as the Métis Nation. As I learned from Sarah, who spoke last week, Boise State is on Shoshone tribal land. I understand from Matt Williamson that the university is in the process of getting its land acknowledgement right, and that's an important process to do, so there's nothing sort of official yet. But last week I was at Buffalo Treaty meeting where Leroy Little Bear from First Nation in Alberta was talking about how now during COVID, we're all sort of connecting, he kept saying in cyberspace, which I sort of like that. But he raised that we're meeting in spirit. And I do think that's a nice way of saying that. So where I'm talking to you from is, you can see on this map, right, where my home is there compared to where you are at Boise State. So we're both sort of right on the edge of a forest. When I look northward, I look to the largest intact forest in the world, the boreal forest in Canada, running across the 10 provinces and 2 of the territories. And then when I look southward, I look to the most endangered ecosystem in the world, and that is the grasslands ecosystem. Really between me and you there, between me and the Rocky Mountains, stretching all the way down south into Texas. This picture is a good illustration of sort of where I live. My husband, who is American, took this photograph of the bald eagle, but it shows you that Aspen Parklands, where I live, are so it's where the prairie actually sort of meets the forest. And so it rolls right into the forest. So it's an agricultural working landscape, but it is rich in biodiversity. And a bit about my background. So I do have a PhD from Purdue University. I went on Slack and I watched all of your introductory videos, which were amazing. That was so nice. And you all, the students in HES, sound amazing and have like such dedication and focus and passion for what you are doing right now. When I was like an MA student, I just thought like political science sounds neat. Like I had no idea what I was doing. And even when I came to Purdue, I was there to translate the last of Karl Marx's German work into English. I didn't even start studying environmental policy until the second year of my PhD. But I ended up, and really it was because I was an international student who couldn't work during the summer. So I had to work on campus, and a professor hired me to like go talk to people about a bat. And I was just like, whatever, right? Like, yeah, I need to eat. And then totally sort of changed my life. But I spent my time at Purdue really thinking about landowners and our values and perceptions around land, and how that sort of mediates what we're willing to do for other living things. And then when I got a job in Canada and I came back home, I started to think more about the comparison between Canada and the United States, which is what I'm going to talk a lot about today. And after that, I sort of moved on, after I wrote that sort of book, I moved on to thinking about the role that cities play. There was a lot of attention around cities as sort of hotspots for climate mitigation and adaptation. And so I was wondering, what are they doing for conservation? And then I've done some work looking at zoos. Zoos have always been this like big question mark for me. Like, you know, is it okay to go to a zoo? And so I actually, you know, wanted to look into that. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at the vast contribution that zoos make to conservation of species at risk in North America. And I've done work with energy policy in the grasslands ecosystem. And then more recently, and this is more what I'll talk about today, I've become interested in how can we change the politics around wildlife conservation, and a new project that I'm working on looking at bison restoration in the grasslands. So I do, though, want to just throw out my Sergio connection. So I ran the Monarch Ultra last year. It was a year ago yesterday, actually, that I was running. So this was this like crazy group of people who decided to run the entire migratory route of the monarch butterfly. So that's like 3,000 miles from Peterborough, Ontario, down into Mexico. And we ran it as a relay. So there was like literally always one person running, and like, well, we didn't run through the night, but like handing off the baton to each other. So you could either run 31 miles or you could run 62 miles. And I ran 31 miles through Indiana. But I looked at the list of the runners. There was like 100 of us. And I was looking to see like, oh, are there other professors or people in conservation? And I saw Sergio's name and I was like, oh, I really want to contact him. And then totally forgot, never thought about it again. And Matt Williamson sent out the list of speakers and I saw his name again. And I was like, oh, I need to look him up. And so it's the same guy, and I really am now going to email him. And I don't know what this says about conservation people. Maybe if you're not already trail running, this could just be your fate. Like, maybe you just need to get some shoes and go for it. This seems to be something that we're doing. This Monarch Ultra is running again next year. So if you are interested in joining, raising some awareness about the monarchs and about the migration and the relationship between those three countries, you would be more than welcome to join us. So what am I going to be talking about today? So I thought a lot about what would be interesting about my research. And what I kept circling back to is what I'm really passionate about is Canada and the United States. I love both countries. I'm married to an American. You know, my parents live in the United States 6 months of the year. I've spent a lot of time there. I lived there for 10 years myself. And we share a lot of wildlife. We share a lot of other things, a lot of ecozones. And I really want more collaboration between Canada and the United States when it comes to our work in wildlife and conservation. And so part of what I want to focus on today is just how are the two countries different, and then sort of what, like where are the places that I'm most hopeful about, or I see the greatest potential for transformation. And so I only started learning about environmental policy in the United States. And so I sort of feel like my base layer, my default is always the American system. And there's so much to like about the way the United States is doing it, particularly this system where you can create a law at the federal level and it applies everywhere. And so you have these sort of infamous command and control policies of the 1970s, like the Endangered Species Act, where it's set by the federal government, and then there's sort of the two agencies in this instance that are tasked with controlling, right, with implementing the law, and it applies, you know, across all public and private land in the United States. And as messy as that can be in implementation, and as many criticisms as we can have about it, and as many amendments that the ESA has gone through, it is one consistent law, and there is something to be said about that. In Canada, no matter how much the media likes to present our prime minister as this young, vibrant, powerful young man, when it comes to environmental policy, the prime minister is a weakling. There is no doubt about it. So this is not just about Justin Trudeau. This is the Prime Minister of Canada. This is showing around the carbon tax, I guess, disagreements in the country since Trudeau has come into office. Maybe not everyone appreciates immaculate clean air as much as they should, and the provinces have really pushed back on climate change in Canada, and that's because it's within their jurisdiction. It's really a provincial issue, and there's not a lot the federal government can do about it. That is very similar to how it works for conservation for wildlife. The federal government is very weak when it comes to this issue. And so what ends up happening is how it's organized in Canada is so different than how it is organized in the United States. We have this one federal government in Ottawa, and then we have the 10 provinces and the 3 territories. We also have 650 first, or at least 650 First Nation who have an inherent right to sovereignty, the Inuit and the Métis Nation. And in our Constitution, we have a division of powers, particularly Section 48 and 49, which are important here, that lay out who is responsible for what, and it's messy. So the provinces are responsible for natural resources. That's huge on its own. And then provinces are responsible for private land and provincial crown land, so public land that the province owns, which is huge. And then the federal government is responsible for like a whole suite of things, but in relation to conservation, they're responsible for federal lands and like international treaties, for example. We also have the Indian Act, we have like Section 35 of the Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a lot of Supreme Court cases that lay out the power and authority of Indigenous governments in Canada when it comes to conservation, or what we would call natural resources, things like fishing or hunting rights. And that can also complicate the picture a bit as well. And you may be thinking, well, who really cares what Canada is doing? It's a huge empty country. Certainly they can't be having a problem with wildlife. And I like, I'm one to always point out that we have, like, there are more house cats in America than there are Canadians in the world. So we are the 2nd largest country in the world, and we only have 36 million people. And from your perspective, or Americans' perspective, there's probably not all Americans on the Zoom, but I can understand where a lot of people think there's all this space in Canada. Certainly there shouldn't be a problem from a conservation perspective. And I shared in the Slack channel, so if you haven't had a chance to see it, take a look. The most recent World Wildlife Federation Canada report, that's really like grim, you know, like we are not doing well in Canada when it comes to the protection of wildlife. Pretty much everything is on the decline except for invasive species. And that is shocking to a lot of people. And you might be thinking, how is that possible? And so World Wildlife Federation Canada broke it down into these sort of main threats. And so that's overexploitation being one of the big ones, followed by invasive species, pollution, that little pesky climate change problem, transportation or like roads would be a big one, system modification, urban development, energy, human disturbances, agriculture, and then the little tiny one being like natural geological events as a threat to wildlife. So there are a lot of different, like I said, drivers, right, of decline happening across the country, and we're not doing that well. So what are we doing about it? So like I said, the federal government in Canada only has jurisdiction over migratory birds. And that's largely through an international or bilateral treaty with the United States, the Migratory Bird Act. So that's a federal thing. Most aquatic species in the country are federal jurisdiction, not all, but most, and then federal land. The problem is there's actually not that much federal land in the country that is not Indigenous land or in the territories. So across the 10 provinces, the federal government is really limited. We're talking about post office, national parks, military bases, things like that. So if the federal government wants to protect something, it would have to be one of these two, either birds or aquatic species, or on federal lands. So they passed the 2002 Species at Risk Act, but it only pertains to those things. So it's nothing like the American ESA, which applies to any listed species and its habitat anywhere in the United States. this law, the Canadian law, is applying. So like a species, like here it is at the post office, or in the park, safe, right? It wanders off. Now it's the province's responsibility. So that's a pretty limited law. And maybe not being totally fair to the Species at Risk Act, but I just want to point out that it is very different and much weaker than the American law because of the way federalism has been designed and because of how powerful the provinces really are. So when the provinces and the territories have jurisdiction over the public land or private land, that turns out to be most land, and that also can vary by province. So where I am in Saskatchewan, it's mostly private land. And then in other provinces, there might be a lot more provincial crown land. And then in some, like British Columbia, it gets even more complicated. They have a lot of federal parks. And then they also have a lot of unceded Indigenous land. So policy becomes a lot more complicated. The result is that then the 10 provinces and the 3 territories are left really with the responsibility of creating their own program and policy for species at risk. And I will mention that the federal government technically has an emergency order or a safety net policy that says, okay, if the province is like really screwing it up, we'll step in and help out. Sarah, well, that's what the policy is called, Species at Risk Act. Sarah is 18 years old, a full-grown adult now. The federal government has only invoked this safety net twice, once in Saskatchewan actually for the sage grouse, and once in Quebec for the chorus frog. Is that what it's called? The chorus frog, yeah. So it's not something that the federal government does often or does lightly. So really, for the most part, it is up to the provinces if the wildlife is on provincial lands or on private land. And where this gets even more complicated is then our prime minister can go on television or on YouTube, as he did yesterday, and make these huge grand commitments. I'm super supportive of them, and I love that Canada is committed to protecting 30% of our land by 2030. But you got to be a bit careful there because, yes, the federal government has the ability to make international commitments and sign on to international treaties, but they don't have the power when they get back home to actually implement it. That's provincial responsibility. So we saw this happen with climate change, right? With the Kyoto Protocol back in the 90s, the federal government signs on and says, yes, we're all for doing something about climate change, comes back and the provinces are like, actually, no, we're not. And sort of similar to the Paris Protocol for climate change. But again, this is an initiative where the federal government is saying we have grand aspirations of protecting 30% of land, right? And that's a big thing. Canada is the second largest country in the world. It's big for Canada to say that. Again, I'm fully supportive. I'll come back to this in a minute. But the federal government doesn't have 30% of the land in the country to protect. So Trudeau has to come back and work with the provinces. And on something like species at risk, they tried this in the 1990s. The federal government made a big commitment with the UN Conservation on Biological Diversity, and then was like, okay, provinces, let's do something. And the provinces were like, okay, sure. And in 2020, we still have 4 provinces and 2 territories that have done nothing. If we like to look at this spatially, this is a bit old, this report card. I really should update it, but 2013, this was done by a group called EcoJustice in collaboration with the David Suzuki Foundation. Really, the grade book has not changed though. What I'll draw your attention to is that the entire Western, like half the country, is getting an F because they have no policy. So Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, and the Yukon never made any standalone legislation for species at risk. So yes, the federal SARA would apply to federal lands inside those provinces. But otherwise, if you are a species at risk, you don't have a law to protect you. You might have some programs or some policies, in place, but not an actual law. And the rest of the country is also not looking great on this report card. Why is Canada doing so bad? A big one is a failure to list. So we're simply not we're not able to assess species at risk quickly enough. And then the listing process has had some problems. But I would say the bigger one has really been a failure to protect habitat. So normally, for example, under the American ESA, you list a species and its critical habitat gets protected at the same time. In Canada, that's not what happens. So a species gets identified, it can be added to SARA, and then during the process of writing a recovery plan, but more really the action plan. So each species gets two plans. One is like the scientific document of what's necessary. And then the second one, the action plan, is the policy one about, so how are we going to do it? And we have very few action plans in existence in Canada. But it's really at that sort of stage where the critical habitat becomes protected. So it's not, so listing a species doesn't automatically protect its habitat. For some species, it's been easier than others, but the problem is that the federal government can't list a species onto SARA and protect habitat because it doesn't control the habitat. So it can identify it, but it can't protect it because it doesn't own that land. It's provincial land. And both provinces, like provincially and federally, doing stuff on public land has been easier than doing it on private land. I mean, the United States also struggles with privately managed land, and that's something I've spent a lot of time studying, a lot of time sitting at landowner, kitchen tables, talking to them about sort of the incentive mechanisms or other mechanisms to help them manage their land in ways that would help endangered species. But in Canada, the problem has been really that no province is willing to like actually regulate private land. So Ontario is the only province that's tried, and it passed the Ontario Endangered Species Act. It immediately exempted most industries like forestry or hydroelectricity or wind from the main provisions of the law. So that kind of already sounds crazy. The law technically does apply to private land, but the Ontario government has not implemented it, not giving out any penalties or anything like that on private land. So we simply don't have a system in Canada where anyone is regulating species at risk on privately managed land. So why is this so bad? Why is it bad for you and me and for the United States? Well, it's in part just because Canada's wildlife is declining. It's also bad because as forest fires burn, as climate change changes the world, changes North America, we do see the migratory patterns of wildlife changing. We also see where wildlife is currently living and moving is in a northward direction, coming towards Canada. It's also a problem just that there's regulatory mismatch. So that in some places there's a law, and then in Idaho, there's a law. Alberta, no law, right? And then the organizational mismatch that comes with that. In Idaho, it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I think Region 1, probably, yeah, Region 1, the Northwest. And then if somebody, so what's a shared species? Should look this up, the grizzly bears. So if you are with the Fish and Wildlife Service and you're working on grizzly bears and you want to, communicate with somebody in Alberta about this, there is no equal to the Fish and Wildlife Service in Alberta. So that's a federal in the United States, then is trying to work with a province, and the province is like, oh yeah, actually we don't have policy for the grizzly bear in our province. If you want to talk to somebody at Banff, right, at the National Park Service, you could try giving them a call. They give you their Ottawa number. Somebody, answers in French, just hang up and call back or whatever, right? Like there's not this clean and neat organizational match between the two countries. That's maybe a bit unfair of an example, but it can be a bit difficult. if you are living in a place where your border province doesn't have an agency or a policy in place. And then, of course, I think it's just problematic that a lot of Canada lacks regulation. But I don't want this to be too grim of a story. And so what I've been spending time on in the last couple years, I went on sabbatical or on research leave in 2018, 2019, and I drove from Toronto to my home in Saskatchewan. And then we drove up to the Yukon and Alaska, all the way down the West Coast to San Diego, over into New Mexico. We lived in Utah for a couple of months, and then we came back to Saskatchewan. So that was like a whole sort of 16 months of living in Western Canada, the United States. And I was redesigning my class and thinking a lot about this book from 2000 called Politics of the Wild. So I looked up the author on Twitter, and I actually sent her a message to say, hey, do you want to update this book and think about transformative politics? And she tweeted me back and was like, yeah, let's do it. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, sort of identifying the barriers, and then thinking about transformation through Indigenous reconciliation and through policy and governance. And this is actually a picture of the wood bison. So there's a wild herd in northern British Columbia. And when we were driving through BC, we came across the herd, and you have no choice but to just stop and wait, because they take the entire highway and everything, and they're just on their own schedule. And so we were there for 3 hours. They don't, so you can honk, it doesn't matter, right? They're just laying on the highway. And so we had ample opportunity to get out and take pictures and sort of spend some time. We had our cat with us on this entire road trip for the 16 months, and he was terrified of these bison, but we sure enjoyed it. So thinking about what are we doing that's transformative, going back to Justin Trudeau and what the federal government can do. So we have a government at our federal level who is very supportive of conservation, but recognizing the constraints that that government is working under, his government has chosen to do things that they have the power to do. So they put $1.3 billion behind conservation over the next 5 years. And then they have chosen to focus on these 11 areas. They're calling them biodiversity hotspots. That's not a scientific designation per se. It's places in the country where the federal government has some jurisdiction. So it's where they own a lot of land or where they have a lot of connections and inroads. And these are the 11 places that they are going to be working on while the Trudeau government is in power. And so they want to recover these areas across the country. And so there's one in each province, two in one along BC, Alberta, and then up in the Yukon. And so they're putting a lot of focus into that. And then similarly, the call to protect 30% by 2030. The other things that I think that are happening that are exciting and are worth research and worth thinking about is a large sort of effort around Indigenous protected conservation areas. I guess in the United States, they're often called tribal parks. I think there's been more attention to intertribal cross-border conservation efforts. So tribes and bands across the border working with each other. And I do see, Canada has put a lot of money into support for Indigenous guardian programs and Indigenous-led efforts. And I suppose there's the criticisms of that, but there's also a lot of benefits to those policies. Integrated decision making is something that I think we need a lot more of, and it's something that I guess the research group at Boise State is probably well steeped in. But this is thinking about, we're all working in these little silos for the most part, and it's not till we get groups together like this that we start thinking about, how does climate change governance and sustainability governance and biodiversity conservation really become about one thing. And in governments, we often have a Ministry of Natural Resources, a Ministry of Health, a Ministry of Education. And this would be saying something like, if we were to mainstream biodiversity with climate change and sustainability, then that is part of the environment. That is part of the justice system. That is part of natural resources. Like, it's no longer just the Ministry of Environment responsible for these things. It's all ministries responsible for them all the time. They're interconnected. We can't have social justice without having climate justice or biodiversity justice, and we can't have an education system that isn't tied to these things. So it's really about, instead of siloed, right, and it's about interdisciplinary work. It's about, like a lot of you who are scientists or social scientists, like working together and having conversations together. I think it's also about bringing in, the poets and the philosophers and the artists and, that sort of thing. But it's taking a much more holistic approach, and understanding the ways that climate and biodiversity and sustainability are really the same thing, and they're part of all of those things. And so I think there's growing momentum with that, and I think there's a lot, we should be very excited about that and be putting in a lot of energy into that. I think federal leadership in Canada has been really important. Stephen Harper's government, prior to Trudeau's government, did not invest in conservation or climate change to the same extent. And it left a lot of like mixed signals and a lot of provinces going off into different directions. And now, as limited as our federal government is sending clearer commitment, like clearer messages around commitments to doing something on climate change, and then so in the throne speech, so in the parliamentary system, they took like a break, and then when government came back and reconvened for the fall, they begin with what's called a throne speech, and so it's sort of like a State of the Union, and Trudeau lays out sort of his big plans, and in that he announced this 25% by 2025, and then yesterday through the United Nations Summit he announced the 30% by 2030. So those are really clear sort of signals from the federal government that we're going in this direction. And then I also think another thing that's happening that we need a lot more of is sort of cross-border environmental groups working. So we have some examples like Y2Y, which is something a lot of you are probably familiar with, the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative. And then we have a lot of American or international NGOs that have a counterpart in Canada and sometimes a counterpart at provincial level. But I do see more like collaboration happening and a lot more excitement from, and in part because they're having more federal funding maybe in Canada. There's still a lot of work to be done there, but that would be another sort of area. And then I would say just academics and academic conferences. I am somebody who's really benefited from being in 2 countries and from being in political science and geography and traveling in different circles. But I do think that what academics are doing is really important and really does matter. And I think going to, and I guess now I'm speaking more to students, but going to conferences that are like a little outside your niche area and talking to people from other disciplines or who are working on semi-related areas are some of like the most enriching experiences. Geographers are like a really cool group of people. I spent 10 years in university and I never took a single geography course. And I kind of cringe saying that because now I'm actually like a tenured professor in geography, and I always think my colleagues are going to call my bluff on this. But I didn't, and it took me a long time to come around and understand how awesome geography is. But there's a lot of great things happening in those circles, and that would be sort of one example. But also just the research that academics are doing is making a difference. And so I sort of do want to end my talk on that, and maybe even launch discussion. Just often, because when I talk about biodiversity, like I teach this wildlife class, and every week my students are so depressed, and it can be a depressing thing. And I just want to circle back to that conservation really can work. And I saw this article a couple weeks ago in Conservation Letters talking about how the rate of extinction would be worse if we didn't have the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and if we weren't putting in all this hard work that we're doing. And so they're highlighting the work done by governments, non-governmental organizations, zoos, scientists, volunteers, and others. And I guess I'm lumping us into that scientist category, but I think that the work that you're doing, the projects that you're doing sound amazing. The work that we're doing really does matter. So whether it's the California condor or the bald eagle, or I'm very hopeful about the whooping cranes, that we are recovering species, and that we are maybe also important to keep in mind preventing things from going extinct that would otherwise go extinct if we weren't doing the hard work that we're doing. And I really do truly think that this work is important, and so that I'm hoping that you will, one of the problems that Canada has, going back to the 36 million people comment, is that there's just not enough of us to work on all the areas that need to be worked on. And so for a lot of things, we have data deficiency, or we just don't have enough people or scientists interested in species or ecosystems that are here. A really good example where the northern leopard frog is a species of concern in Saskatchewan, and I see them like all the time. And so I'm always taking photos and sending it to Environment Canada, and they finally emailed me back, and we were like, yeah, we know. We just don't know anyone that, like, do you know any frog people? We just don't know anyone who studies them. Like, the guy who wrote the management plan actually studies Arctic birds. But like, that's the best that they could do, right? And so I do think there's, a lot of room in Canada for people who are interested in wildlife conservation to get involved, as complicated as I just made it sound. But nevertheless, I do think that we need more people thinking about our two countries together and a lot of the corridors that our species share. Okay, so I for once in my life did not talk too much, because I can talk forever about this. So I want to leave, obviously, a chance for questions, comments, and then I also am fully on board with participating in the Slack channel if people prefer to have questions in that forum as well. That I'm totally comfortable with that too.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrea. I'm gonna try and turn on this grid view. If you have a question, you're welcome. I think, Callie, maybe you have your hand up. If you could turn on your camera so we can see you, and then you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. That was really interesting and insightful. And I have two questions. One is, what is Environment Canada again?
Sorry, what? What is Environment Canada?
Yeah, you said you emailed Environment Canada.
Yeah, so that's like, yeah, that's the federal government, Environment Canada.
Oh, it's called. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what they're called. Yeah.
Oh, and then my other question is, in the United States, you know how nonprofits play a pretty big role in being kind of intermediary between federal government and oversight and regulation. Do they play a similar role in Canada and provide kind of a gap resource that's not there? Are they filling in a gap in Canada?
Yes. So yes, they are, but it's still more limited, I guess, because we're just a much smaller country, but also, and I don't mean to like forever talk about federalism. That's just the political scientist in me. But what ends up happening is, so normally in the United States, if you're a nonprofit or you're an interest group and you want to like lobby the government, you can just form and lobby the federal government because that's who has the power. In Canada, you need to lobby provinces. And so it becomes kind of cost prohibitive because you have to lobby each one. And so you end up with a whole bunch of sort of like niche interest groups or nonprofits that don't have like a national perspective or don't have a lot of resources then to pull from. So like, I am on the board of directors for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society Saskatchewan. So we have our little Saskatchewan branch, and then each province has its own branch, and then we have the federal CPAWS that I guess is our like main head institution. But because the provinces like work so differently, like we face different constraints and different challenges, so it can be hard to work. Even though we're the same organization, it can even be hard for us to work together and federally and provincially than it is for like American institutions. I'm sorry, that was a very long answer. And maybe
That was great, thank you.
I mean, the answer to your question was yes. Yes, we have nonprofits.
While other folks are thinking about questions, I guess I have a question, and that is sort of setting aside the challenge that Canada's Species at Risk Act is sort of limited in the footprint, meaning it can't apply to big chunks of the country. It's also 30 years newer. I wonder if you can speak to any useful innovations that sort of came out in the 30 years between when the US came up with the Endangered Species Act and 2003 when SARA was passed. Like, are there tools in the Canadian version of that law that, if they were to be widely applied, would be really critical?
Yeah, so I guess again, it's the difference between how it's written and how it's implemented. But at least I think the two unique things about SARA that I like as opposed to the ESA, so the language of SARA specifically includes the precautionary principle. So as to say, when we're not scientifically certain, we're going to err on the side of caution. And that's supposed to be in the listing of species as well as in their recovery. And that principle is beautiful in conception, I suppose. It has been a little harder to implement. But it does say, like, right, if we don't have enough data on a species, we technically should just err and protect it, right? Until we find out otherwise. And then I really do think the one thing that Canada maybe doesn't get enough credit for is its inclusion or its aspirations of including Indigenous traditional knowledge. And so this does speak in part to that it was 30 years later and to Canada's differing relationship to its Indigenous peoples. But it has certainly, and there's lots of criticisms and faults, but it has aspired to include Indigenous people and to really take seriously and try to grapple with how do we use Indigenous knowledge and hold it equal to Western science, and what does that look like? And we're not getting it right, and it's not been perfect, but we're doing even more than just hand waving. That we're actually trying to do it, and I think that that's something that would only be possible by a law written in 2002. But I mean, I would say, like, the American Endangered Species Act from how it's written in 1973 is very different to how it is now. And so things like habitat conservation plans or different like incentive mechanisms, safe harbor agreements, all of those things evolved to become more flexible. And Species at Risk Act didn't need those because it's not implementing anything on private land. So it didn't need to have those same kind of regulatory like flexibility and tools that the ESA has. And if anything, I think like the leaders in the 1990s wanted the American ESA in Canada, but were like quickly smacked down by Quebec and then Alberta being like, you are not passing a federal law that is going to regulate provincial land. And so I do think that the initial sort of crafters of SARA wanted it to be much more like the ESA, and it just couldn't be.
Awesome, thank you. I see Nicholas has his hand up, and then Sheila. So Nicholas, if you can turn on your camera and ask your question, go for it.
Okay, just give me a second to turn on my camera here. Thanks to the host for allowing outsiders to listen in. I'm actually a professor at University of Toronto, and Andrea and my paths have crossed on committees, but we don't know one another very well. But I'm very interested in this trans-border conservation idea. And it did remind me that there is a Commission on Environmental Cooperation under NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act, that's specifically supposed to facilitate conservation efforts across the three countries. And I think one area that they worked on quite a bit is monarchs. But I wonder what the future of the Commission is given the change in NAFTA. And Andrea, are you familiar with the Commission at all? Do you have any opinion on its role in coordinating, transboundary conservation in North America?
Yeah, so thank you. And nice to see you, actually. Yeah, so the CEC does, I would say, much more work on very like collaborative information awareness. Like that's how they've sort of carved out their role. But interestingly, through them and through NAFTA, and I think this is still in the new NAFTA. So you like one country can sue another for not upholding its own environmental laws, and so Mexico has tried to sue both U.S. and Canada for failing to protect species at risk, and that hasn't gained much traction. But that has been a mechanism through which I think there's been a lot of like discussion and like high, I guess, like more like elite level discussions on policy. But it always circles back to the fact that Canada and the United States have a hard enough time from bilateral relationships, let alone including Mexico, whose again federal system is slightly different and who is facing just much different resource constraints. So, I mean, I do think there's a lot of interesting questions there. And yes, they did actually sponsor or gave money to the Monarch Ultra. So they were part of that as well. And that has been their flagship species, I believe, is the monarch butterfly, is their like symbol even. I used to know much more about it when I taught trilateral policy, but I'm hesitant to say anything because it was just renegotiated. So I now don't want to make statements about the new NAFTA that may no longer be true.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question though.
Sheila, you moved on my screen, but I think that you still have your hand raised.
Oh, Sheila.
I'm trying. Okay, let's see. Everything's lagging here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I see Rich had mentioned something about critical habitat being a bit of a weak point in the ESA as well. And we just recently had the decision for the Rescue Bumblebee that in the US, the critical habitat designation was not found prudent or something. I don't remember the exact language, but it seems like that's definitely one of the limitations on the US side. And I was wondering if you can comment about how important the critical habitat designations are in both countries.
For sure. All right. Thank you, Sheila. One of your future speakers right here. That's awesome. Yeah, so the critical designation part is like, to me, it's like the key part, right? Like, I mean, why list a species if you're not going to protect its habitat? The habitat is the species. Like it's that sort of like, and that's sort of what the ESA got right from the beginning, which was to say, when we list a species at the same time, we're going to list its habitat, because you can't protect like the species without protecting like where it lives, which seems like a no-brainer. And then I think the precedent-setting one was the polar bear. So when the polar bear was listed, it was the first, I think, somebody can fact check me on this. Where's Dale Daniels when you need him? I think when they listed the polar bear, they delayed listing the habitat, and then that continually got delayed and delayed. And I'm not sure that the polar bear's habitat has ever been listed, and that has to do with climate change. And it would be, because if you actually listed its habitat and then tried to protect it, you would be obligated to do something about climate change, and nobody in the United States wants to be obligated to do something about climate change, not in a legal way anyway, right? So that was the problem with the polar bear. And then I think it became the situation where all of a sudden, oh, we can list the species without listing its habitat at the same time. And I think a lot of those discussions have been around business and industry, agriculture, forestry. That's certainly been the case in Canada. And I mean, Sheila, you would know a lot about, in the case of Ontario, some of that, having sat on the agency that's responsible for making recommendations to the government to list species. But in both countries, we really lag on identifying the habitat, and then in the case of Canada, particularly just never getting around to protecting it because we're never writing those action plans. So again, in Canada, it's like two-step process. You have the recovery strategy, which is scientists telling us everything that's needed to save the species, and then the action plan is putting that into action, and in the action is where you would then protect habitat, and we're never doing that. We're not writing action plans. And then where we are is for national parks, because the federal government can do it without needing any help from any other actor. So it's sad. That's, yeah, now we're depressed again.
Thanks, Andrea.
Well, other folks are thinking of questions. One thing you didn't really talk about and tends to play a big role in, at least in the way the US ESA plays out, is the role of the courts. So, you know, and part of the reason I mentioned it is just because in a number of these critical habitat designations or recovery plans, like those also can be appealed and litigated, et cetera, in the US judicial system. And I'm wondering if you can speak to how that works on the Canadian side.
Yeah, the Canadian side just uses the courts less for everything. We're just not as litigated as the United States is. But that's not to say environmental groups haven't tried. You know, we shut down, well, they tried to shut down a pipeline for species at risk, and that was around 5 different species, and that did at least then trigger that the federal government had to write action plans for those species. And there certainly have been cases where environmental groups, that's Eco-Justice, that's that group there. So they're a group of lawyers, environmental group, and they're the ones that are always taking the federal government to court to actually implement SARA. But we have far fewer examples of that. And I'm trying to think of like a recent one that would have been successful. I mean, they failed on logging in Ontario. I don't know if they've tried again. But I would say in the United States, they've had more success, but you get a little gun shy there on continuing to go the litigation route. Because if you have a law in place, you should enforce it, right? You shouldn't actually have to use the legal system. And I think, and I don't know why I necessarily, I mean, I think I've just heard this sort of in the circles that I travel in, but if you keep poking that bear, and I guess in this sense, we mean Donald Trump, that he might just now decide to get rid of the ESA. And so in a lot of times it's about other mechanisms that we can use that aren't like the hammer, right? Isn't the hammer of the ESA to work with landowners and not have to get the courts involved, because that's immediately alienating and potentially opens the door to a lot of like political battles where I don't know that the country wants to, I don't think that the ESA is fragile, but I think if you keep having to use the courts, there's going to be a question about why do we have this law in the books? And then in Canada, it's just like, I don't know if I have a good enough answer for why culturally we just don't sue each other every day, but we don't. And so that just doesn't, it hasn't been, we're just much more like collaborative, and we're just much more willing to like give industry or business the things that they want behind closed doors and not have it drag out in the courts. So that's really cynical in some ways, but I think that's true.
I think we're more collaborative and or more willing to just give it away behind closed doors.
Yeah, industry has had a huge influence. We're a natural resource producing country. We always have been. And industry has loomed very large in Canadian species at risk policy. like getting exemptions, you know, in Ontario for all of forestry. So if you're going to exempt forestry, like, I mean, that's huge. Like if you look at the province of Ontario, like it's a forest. So, I mean, I know you're thinking Toronto, but look north and it's a forest. And then it's just like, oh, they don't have to worry about the Species at Risk Act. Well, that's insane, right? But that's just one example of sort of the loopholes that industry are given in the country.
Well, we have arrived at 2 o'clock. I want to be conscious of folks' time. For the students who are registered for the course, please do continue to reach out to Andrea over the Slack channel. She's already been in there. So I can commit her to answering any additional questions you have. For the rest of you who joined us today, thanks for coming. And Andrea, thank you again so much for giving us your time. Really enjoyed it, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Have a good day, all.